Okay. Tonight, Soren Kierkegaard, Infinite Passion. Our series is on the relationship between Christianity and the great books. How can various great book authors benefit Christian readers? How can they enhance the life of faith? Tonight I'm talking about Soren Kierkegaard, an author that I have been learning to love over the years. In one sense, the relationship between Christianity and Kierkegaard is an obvious one, hardly worth even mentioning. Kierkegaard was a Christian, a Lutheran living in Denmark in the first half of the 1800s. He wrote extensively about Christianity, talked about God, talked about sin, talked about Jesus. He is in any meaningful sense a Christian author. But on the other hand, in my experience as a Christian in the evangelical world since I became a Christian in the 70s, I have seen several obstacles that come between Kierkegaard and the average Christian. Obstacle number one, Kierkegaard is referred to as the father of existentialism, often. Authors like Jean-Paul Sartre saw him as a foundational influence in developing their philosophy. Both Kierkegaard and the later existentialist philosophers emphasized human freedom and choice. Human beings define themselves by the choices that they make. But as any Christians who are familiar with that situation would know, existentialists like Sartre were atheists. There is no God, there's no absolute standard of right and wrong. Kind of at the heart of their existentialism is this idea that the individual defines themselves by choosing their own path in the void. There is no standard, there is no absolute. You make your own path and define yourself by the choices that you make. So some Christians are suspicious that Kierkegaard is saying something like that. When he says something like truth is subjectivity, many would think, oh yeah, that's what Sartre thought. And so there must be something suspicious about what's going on with Kierkegaard. But I would argue, and you'll see tonight why I would say so, that Kierkegaard does not in any way agree with the later existentialists about that. Yes, we define ourselves by our choices, but we are not choosing in a void. We are choosing for the God who has revealed himself. Obstacle number two, Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer was an early influence on me. I became a Christian in 1971 and almost immediately became involved with people connected with Francis Schaeffer and his L'Abri movement. Schaeffer, at that time, was the man who made it okay to be a Christian and think. It's hard for me to describe the importance of that figure. How many people felt this sense of relief in that there was a man like Schaeffer who would take questions on pretty much anything and say, those are good questions and we ought to think about these things. He talked about history, philosophy, art, and culture. To a certain extent, a place like Gutenberg exists because of the kind of work that someone like Schaeffer did. I think that's not too strong to say. And certainly Mackenzie Study Center, which is the parent organization of Gutenberg College, has a lot of ties back to Schaeffer and L'Abri and all of that kind of stuff. So I loved Schaeffer. He was very influential when I was a young man. I got to meet him once and hear his teaching in a personal setting in someone's living room. Very exciting for a young Christian trying to figure out what's going on. And one of the first things that I learned from Schaeffer was that Kierkegaard was one of the primary bad guys in Western intellectual history. It's there's a line of despair, and it goes right through Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard's the guy who screwed everything up. Schaeffer said this: Kierkegaard came to the conclusion that you could not arrive at, he's talking about Hegel's synthesis at this point, by reason. Instead, you achieved everything of real importance by a leap of faith. So he separated the rational and the logical from faith. This is what Schaeffer thought about what Kierkegaard was doing, and that's where everything really went wrong. To Schaeffer, the problem of Western culture was that it lost sight of the objective truth of the Bible. Notice this quote is from Schaeffer's first book, and notice what it's called: The God Who Is There. I mean, this is his whole point is, look, this is like there really is a God. He really is there. This is objectively true. It's not just a religious idea that gives us comfort, but this is an actual reality. And so to Schaeffer, Kierkegaard's leap of faith meant that even though there was no rational reason for you to have faith, you just needed to leap irrationally. So religious truths are separated from rationality. That's what Schaeffer understood Kierkegaard to be saying. Well, Schaeffer was right that in the 20th century there was a real split in Christian thinking. Many denied the objective historical reality of Jesus, but would argue that the spiritual idea of Jesus was still meaningful. Schaeffer was right in the middle of those arguments when they were happening in the 20th century, and Schaeffer blamed this somewhat on Kierkegaard. So, like I say, I'm forever grateful to Schaeffer for the help that he gave me almost 50 years ago when I was starting my journey of faith, but he's dead wrong about Kierkegaard as far as I'm concerned. Kierkegaard has not separated the rational and the logical from faith. That is not his project at all. Obstacle number 3, Kierkegaard is hard to read. He's very hard to read. I hate this sort of thing, but I'm going to do it anyway. Here's a quote. The self is a relation that relates itself to itself, or is the relations relating itself to itself in the relation. The self is not the relation, but is the relations relating itself to itself. Okay, so now the reason I hate that is it is really not fair to him to do this sort of thing, because if you read Kierkegaard enough, you really become aware he knows perfectly well that what he's doing here. I mean, he knows that this is not easy to follow. And I think he thinks it's good for us to have to think about it, and I think partly he thinks it's funny. It's just, okay, you here, follow me here, and here we go. So my initial reaction when I would read things like this in philosophers in general was, I do not want to get within 100 miles of this guy, because he is being deliberately difficult and life is too short. I have a lot of things that I need to figure out, and I just don't have time to try to figure out that sentence, much less the stack of books that Kierkegaard wrote filled with sentences like that. What am I supposed to do with all that stuff? The fact is, he is, I think, being deliberately difficult. He is an ironic poet. He likes to make you work. He believes that it is good for us to work for this stuff. He basically takes the stance, trust me, it will be worth it. Just hang in there and try to go along with this, and you will profit from this. And for what it's worth, I have come to the spot where I agree with him. I have found the work of trying to understand him very worthwhile. Not that it's for everybody, but that's why I feel a little embarrassed making a quote like that as if to try to put you off of reading him, because the fact is I don't want to put you off of reading him. I think you should read him if you can decide that that sort of a thing is for you. Okay, the focus of this talk is going to be on Kierkegaard and subjectivity. That partly because of what I said at the beginning, some of the challenge for Christian readers of Kierkegaard is this idea that he's an existentialist who has sort of cut himself off from the objective truths of Christianity, or that he teaches the leap of faith, which is just an irrational leap into faith, quite apart from any evidences or reasons to do it. And this is the stuff that Schaeffer didn't like. And so I want to kind of concentrate tonight on looking at that and making the case that this is actually a very important thing that he's teaching, and it is true and very significant to us as Christians. There's a whole ton of stuff to talk about with Kierkegaard. I had an intention of having a second half to this talk where I was going to go on and talk about other aspects of what Kierkegaard says. And when I got through with this part, I realized it was already too long, so I probably had better not do that. So I'm not. I'm going to concentrate on this. But this is the part that I wanted to talk about most of all. Let me make a quick comment about my approach to all of this. I am not a Kierkegaard scholar. So what am I? Why am I up here talking about this? I am a person who has spent my life thinking about what the Bible teaches about the life of faith. I am a person who had the great fortune of having Jack Crabtree tell me many years ago that Kierkegaard was a great Christian thinker. And I am a person who has had the great fortune of reading Kierkegaard as part of the curriculum of Gutenberg College. As Chris said earlier, we do a class in Concluding on Scientific Postscript where we kind of march through it paragraph by paragraph. Not the whole book. We don't make it through the whole book, but a portion of the book, trying to figure out what it is he's saying. Nancy used to do that class, and then I inherited it, and it's been a very profitable thing for me. The other thing is we read Practice in Christianity in the third or fourth year, the junior, senior years. We read the whole book in our Great Conversation class. So I've had those two books to chew on, which have gotten me interested and pushed me out into others, although there's still a lot that I haven't read. So that's who I am. I think I'm a good person to make the case that Kierkegaard can be of interest to Christians because I am a Christian who is allergic to sentences like the one that I just quoted, and yet I find Kierkegaard incredibly personally meaningful. So that's kind of this is a very personal sort of talk. It's kind of my progress report on my attempts to make sense out of what Kierkegaard is saying. So I hope it's profitable. I have a long way to go, but I think I can say some things. There is a danger that I have tried to say too much stuff tonight. We'll see. Okay, so our topic, subjectivity, inwardness, and appropriation. So this part of the talk is largely drawn from Concluding on Scientific Postscript. That's the book that I have spent the most time in because, as I say, each year with the students, we go through it paragraph by paragraph. So I've had a chance to sit and think about what he's saying very specifically in that book for a long time. And that's been very profitable. There's something you should know, though. Concluding on Scientific Postscript is not written by Kierkegaard. It says so right on the title page. I can prove it. It's not written by Kierkegaard. It's written by Johannes Climacus. It is edited by Kierkegaard, though, so I guess we'll learn something about Kierkegaard because he was the editor of this work. Well, as he admits later on, it actually is written by Kierkegaard, but it is written under a pseudonym. Climacus is a character that Kierkegaard has created. He has his own life story, his own attitude towards things. Climacus is not a Christian, actually, although Kierkegaard is a Christian. But most people believe that, for the most part, Climacus says things that Kierkegaard agrees with. He's just coming at it from the particular angle that he has as a person who's very interested in this question of becoming a Christian, but he's concerned about what he hears in the culture about what that means. And he's coming in and taking this apart and saying, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. Many people point out that it is significant that Kierkegaard put his name on it as editor because he wrote a number of works before this that were under various pseudonyms, various characters who wrote them, and he never admitted that he was the author of them. He didn't put his name on them at all. In fact, the story is that he used to hang around. He would go at the intermission time at the theater. He would go and hang around in the lobby to give people the impression that he had seen the show, the play, because he wanted to give people the impression that he was spending all his time lounging around, watching plays and doing stuff like that, so that they wouldn't know that he was actually at home writing these books under another name. So he was very serious about not having people know that he wrote them until the work that I'm largely talking about tonight, concluding Unscientific Postscript, at the end of it, he fesses up and says, all those books with all those names, I wrote those. But up until this point, he had not admitted it, although I think most people knew it. Okay. So most people believe that, as I say, that Climacus is saying stuff that Kierkegaard agrees with, and that is the stance that I'm taking here tonight. I'm not taking any great pains to distinguish between Climacus and Kierkegaard in what I'm saying. Largely because if you look at the ideas that Climacus puts forward, you can find pretty much all of them expressed in other works that Kierkegaard did put his name on. So it's pretty safe. You wouldn't want to do that with some of the other pseudonyms. Some of the other characters that he writes under are arguing for specifically non-Christian ways of looking at the world, and you don't want to. That's not the way Kierkegaard thought about things, but he wanted to explore that idea, and he did it in a character. Okay, so let me start here. I just picked a phrase that seems to me to capture something of what Climacus wants to talk about. So I want to talk about a couple of these words. The phrase is the state of the knowing subject in existence. This is something that Climacus is interested in talking about. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit. First of all, there's this concept of existence or existing. This is a hugely important word to Kierkegaard. This is the word that gives existentialism its name. Existentialism is the philosophy that deals with existing. In our modern idiom, we might see existing as describing a very flat, passive sort of thing. I might say something like, I feel like I'm not really living, I'm just existing. Well, that's the opposite of the way Kierkegaard would use a word like this. For Kierkegaard, it might be something more like, I feel like I'm not really existing, I'm just living. Existing is the dynamic thing. Existing is to be fully engaged in the task of figuring out how to live a human life. That's what existing is about. So, a couple of little quotes. The first one who is existing is in the continual process of becoming. Becoming means changing. This goes back at least to Plato, who distinguishes being and becoming. The eternal truths, the forms and the good and all of that, that is eternal. That has being. It doesn't change. It just bees. But we are finite material beings. We are becoming. That is, tomorrow I'm going to be someone a little different than what I was today. And I have been becoming over the 65 years of my life. There's a lot of changes that have happened over that time, and they're going to continue to happen through the rest of my life. So existing is this process of becoming. It emphasizes the idea that we are people who change. And then the second quote, by the way, I should say, for Plato, being was where the action was, right? The eternal, unchangeable stuff, that's the good stuff. That's the cool stuff. For Kierkegaard, becoming is where the action is, because we are becoming. We are changing, finite people, figuring out how to be a changing, finite person and how you live as a changing, finite person. That's where the action is. I'm not eternal and unchanging. That's all nice. I can look at that. But the thing is, I've got to figure out how to exist, how to live as a changing person. And then the other quote is, existence itself is a striving. So this existing that he's talking about is not a flat, a passive thing. Existing means striving. Striving to understand what my life should be. Striving to figure out what is right and to pursue it, what is good and pursue it. To exist is to be actively engaged in figuring out what it means to live as a human person. That's what existing is about. And that's all kinds of existentialism are about, that topic. How do I figure out what it means to exist, to live as a human, finite, changing, deciding sort of person? Another phrase he used there was the knowing subject. So let's consider a person in the act of knowing something. Okay, so let's say I know that texting while driving is illegal in Oregon. That is something that I know. There is a subject and an object, right? I am the subject of the sentence. I know that texting while driving is illegal. I am the subject. I am the one that's doing the knowing. And then the object that is being known is this law, that it is illegal to text while you drive. So when we talk about objectivity and subjectivity, objectivity focuses on the object, the thing being known. Objectively speaking, what is that law? What exactly does it say? What are the penalties? What was the reasoning that went into it, and so on? That's the objective truth about that law, the thing that I know. But subjectivity is about me, the subject, the one who is knowing this law. What is my relationship to this law? What am I going to decide to do about it? What am I going to do in response? What do I think of it? Maybe I'm terrified of being arrested, and so I strictly comply, but not because I care about texting, just because I don't want to be arrested. Maybe I am filled with hatred for society, and so I eagerly, savagely break the law, even though I don't even really need to text anyone. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways that I, as the subject, knowing this law, can react to it, can choose to embrace it, defy it, all of that sort of stuff. So objectivity is about the thing being known, the object. Subjectivity is about the personal response of the knower, the subject, the choices in particular, the choices made in response to this knowledge. Kierkegaard often refers to people as the subject because he wants to highlight that life is active, not passive. The subject is the one doing the knowing, who must decide what to do with this knowledge. So he keeps calling people, the subject does this, the existing subject, the knowing subject. And by subject he means the person. But the person is the one, the object is that thing that's trying to be known, like, say, Christianity. The subject is the one who's deciding, what am I going to do with it? What does it mean to me? How am I going to respond? So we don't just know things, we respond to what we know. And that's a key aspect of what we're talking about. But an important qualifier in this way of looking at things for Kierkegaard is that we're talking about essential knowledge. An awful lot of philosophy is about knowing things, about epistemology, we call it, the study of how we know things. A philosopher might ask whether I can really know whether that chair exists or whether I myself exist or, those kinds of questions. I'm not saying that those are bad questions to ask, but Kierkegaard is not interested in those questions. That's not the kind of knowledge that he wants to explore. His topic is essential knowledge. Some knowledge is essentially, inescapably related to me as a subjective, existing person. And Kierkegaard tells us explicitly what that essential knowledge is. It is the ethical and the ethical religious. So what we're talking about is my knowledge of the ethical, what is right, what is wrong, and the religious. God, the doctrines of Christianity, all those things that call on me to make a subjective response, a choice as to what it is that I'm going to do. So this phrase then that I started out with, where he talks about the state of the knowing subject in existence, means something like the situation of the person passionately engaged in the struggle to relate himself or herself to the essential truth. And by that he would mean Christianity. So that's the thing that he's interested in talking about. Okay, I have another quote that I want to look at. Christianity is spirit. Spirit is inwardness. Inwardness is subjectivity. Subjectivity is essentially passion. And at its maximum, an infinite, personally interested passion for one's eternal happiness. Okay, so this is a paragraph that students wrestle with a bit. There's a lot to think about here. Let me kind of take you through it quickly as to what I think is going on. Christianity is spirit. Christianity is concerned with the human spirit and its relationship with the divine spirit, for that matter. Spirit is inwardness. That is, Christianity involves the inner person, not just the outer circumstances. We're interested in the moves that the inner person makes. I mean, we're interested in what I do outwardly, but we all recognize that what I do outwardly starts with moves that are happening inside. It's the inside where the action is. Inwardness is subjectivity. And as we saw, we have an idea about what we're talking about with subjectivity here. This is the person making choices about how he or she is going to respond, to deal with that object, that truth that I'm dealing with out here. Inwardness is subjectivity is to say that the inward moves that we're talking about here, what we're really talking about it's the will and choices of the human person. We're talking about the subjective response. Will I embrace it? Will I reject it? Christianity is calling for a subjective response on my part, a subjective acceptance of its truths. Subjectivity is essentially passion. That is, Christianity calls us to turn our will toward it, to want what it promises. This is what he means by passion. It is not some sort of involuntary lust that we might picture passion. We're talking about desire, a strong desire rooted in the will. Christianity is presenting me with something and I have a passion for it. I want it. That's the thing I'm going for. Yeah, that's what I want. So, choosing subjectively for Christianity involves this desire, this wanting what it is that it offers. And at its maximum, an infinite, personally interested passion for one's eternal happiness. And I'm saying that this means that Christianity calls for a persevering, personal desire for the blessing of salvation. Okay, so here's again, what is an infinite passion? That's kind of difficult language. It is not infinite in some metaphysical sense, as if I have a passion that somehow fills the universe or something like that. That's not what we mean, I think. I mean, what he means when he talks about an infinite passion is it is an unending passion. I mean, if I happen to, for a time, get this strong desire to get a certain car, and I'm just in love with the idea of getting that car, and I have to have that car, and I get the car, and I really enjoy it for a while, and then I get bored, and I forget about it, and I move on to some other thing that I really want. That is not an infinite passion. That is a finite passion that I had a certain amount of desire and it went a certain distance, but after a while it didn't go the distance. An infinite passion is a passion that goes the distance, a wanting, a longing that's going to go all the way. I'm sticking with that. That is what I want, which I think is very closely related to the biblical concept of perseverance, that this is for me. as things push at me and I get challenged on, do you really want that? Yes, I do. And then another challenge comes. Is your passion for that? Is that what you want? Yes, I do. Because I have an infinite passion. I have a passion that will not end. So, to be a Christian means to have a persevering, unending, deeply personal desire for the eternal happiness that the Bible promises. That's what Kierkegaard is saying here. So, let me show you the quote again. Christianity is spirit. Spirit is inwardness. Inwardness is subjectivity. Subjectivity is essentially passion. And at its maximum, an infinite, personally interested passion for one's eternal happiness. And I would give this as something of a paraphrase of the idea. Christianity speaks to that inward, private place in the human person where the will resides. It calls us to choose, to pursue the blessings of eternal life with persevering, unending, personal desire. That's his statement. Okay. All of that desire and passion, all of that is subjective, right? We're talking about subjectivity, the response of the knower to these truths that are being proclaimed by the Bible. Now, there's a key set of words that Kierkegaard uses a lot whenever he's talking about relating to the truth subjectively. And these words are, and there are others, but appropriation, possession, acquiring, decision. So the idea is, again, I'm the subject. Some truth is being proclaimed in Christianity. I have to appropriate it. That is, I have to choose to make it my own. It's out there as a truth. I can understand it. I can know exactly what it means. But the question is it mine? Do I believe it? Do I live by it? Do I chew on it because I think this is a thing for me? This piece of knowledge is something that I want for me. And so other similar words like possession. Have I taken possession of this truth? Acquiring. Have I acquired this truth for my own? And especially an important word is decision, because for Kierkegaard, the essence of living life as an existing subjective person is decision. I have to decide, what am I going to embrace as true and live by? And in particular, we're talking about Christianity. I have to make the decision as to whether I am going to take the truths of Christianity and make them my own. It's not enough to know objectively what Christianity is. The issue is personally choosing to make those truths a part of your life. And this is the theme that he comes back to over and over again in many different ways. Okay, so why the emphasis on decision? I mean, it's true. It could just be an abstract truth that he can proclaim because it's true, and it is true. But a lot of Kierkegaard's writings are dealing with the problem as he sees it with his own cultural time and place. Kierkegaard is concerned that all around him, Christianity is just being assumed. It's not being acquired. It's not being personally appropriated. It's just sort of in the air. You know, it's part of the environment. It's a thing that happens to you, like the measles or something. So, one of the situations is the fact that he lives in Denmark in the first half of the 1800s. We have this quote here. Here's a person who's thinking about the question. He's a Danish person, and he's asking himself the question, am I really a Christian? And so if he were married, his wife would tell him, hubby darling, where did you ever pick up such a notion? How can you not be a Christian? You are Danish, aren't you? So, and one of the problems that he's facing is that you have a church, a state church. If you are a citizen of Denmark, you are automatically a member of the Lutheran Church. So Christianity is something that just happens to you. You are born into it. Well, what has been lost in that situation? Well, where is the decision? Where is the appropriation? Where is the subjectivity? It's just something that happened to me passively. And Kierkegaard is very concerned that people aren't noticing that that's not really Christianity. That's not what the Bible is calling for. Another aspect, the intellectual environment that he's in, is the thinking of Hegel, who comes before him. He's had a big influence. There's so much. Okay, first of all, this is laughable that I'm trying to explain to you what Hegel thought, because I don't know what Hegel thought. I'm not sure that anybody knows what Hegel thought, but I can tell you something I think of what Kierkegaard thought Hegel thought, and that's significant. That'll help us in what we're doing here. Okay, so maybe you're familiar with Hegel's view of history, where history is this process. At a certain point in time, a certain idea takes hold. People are thinking that this is true. And we call that the thesis. And then there is an opposition to that idea that grows. And so that's the antithesis. People are thinking this is true, and now we have a group, and they go, no, the opposite of that is true. That's not true. And so what happens? There is a mixing together of those things, which he calls synthesis, where there is this new truth that emerges that is a synthesis of the old way and its opposition. And now we have this new truth that emerges. So history has progressed to a new stage. And then it happens again. And so history progresses farther. And then it happens again. And so history progresses farther. There's this cycle of progression. So history, from a Hegelian perspective, is this inevitable progression. It talks about the manifestation of the world spirit, that is, something like God or the spirit of the world is making itself known as we move closer and closer to what really is through this process of synthesis. So history is inevitably progressing toward a manifestation of God and what is true and that sort of thing. At Kierkegaard's time, as I understand it, many in Christian culture would see kind of the triumph of Christian culture and Christian civilization as being a kind of a Hegelian thing, that it's this inevitable, what we have now with Christian truths and Christian culture, this is where this process has taken us. So Christianity is kind of this inevitable triumph. They're not living in our world. Christianity doesn't look like it is triumphing inevitably in our historical situation. But at their time, they'd look at that and say, look, this is winning. So there are two implications to that way of looking at things. First of all, if I look at history the way Hegel does, I can sort of take this abstract stance, sit back and look at the whole thing very objectively, as if this is a process that doesn't really require me to do anything. I can just look and understand the process of history. And even more importantly, if truth is sort of growing and manifesting itself through this process, then this manifestation of the world spirit, this inevitable moving towards a kind of truth, it's something that just happens to you. It's something that happens to you. And if you happen to live earlier in history, kind of tough luck on you. Kierkegaard kind of jokes about that. It's kind of too bad for you if you're back here at this spot and didn't have the opportunity to get all of that truth that's going to emerge down the line. So what is lost with this picture of the sort of inevitable progress of Christian truth through history? Decision, appropriation, subjectivity. It's as if I don't have to do anything, it's just going to all happen. And he complains a lot about that. Anybody who's read Concluding Unscientific Postscript knows that he's really down on Hegel and speculation and especially assistant professors. He's really down on assistant professors. Okay, so now let's take another example. Biblical scholarship. That's a good thing, right? Suppose a biblical scholar proves the reliability of the text. That would be great, wouldn't it? Isn't that great? Well, Kierkegaard says, has the person who did not believe come a single step closer to faith? No, not a single step. What he's saying is, okay, objectively, that's great to have some evidence that the text is reliability. Fine, that's good. I like scholars. Scholars are great. I admire what they do. You show me what the scholar has done. Is that going to do anything to make me a Christian? He says, no, because it can't. Think of all the people who saw the miracles of Jesus and yet did not believe. It is not objective evidence that turns a person into a believer. Evidence is the occasion for the subjective choice to appropriate the truth for oneself. It does not automatically lead to that choice. So is biblical scholarship good? Yeah. But can it do anything essentially to turn me into a believer? No, because what would be lost in that picture? Decision, appropriation, subjectivity. It still remains for me to decide, what am I going to do with this? What is this going to mean to me? Okay, so kind of sum it up in another quote from Concluding on Scientific Postscript. The objective subject accordingly asks about the truth, but not about the subjective truth, the truth of appropriation. With regard to the subject's relation to known truth, it is assumed that if only the objective truth had been obtained, appropriation is an easy matter. It is automatically included as part of the bargain, and in the end, the individual is a matter of indifference. This is kind of a general thing that can happen in the intellectual life of a culture or a people or at any time. That idea that somehow the key thing is, if we can just objectively establish what's true in this situation, then everybody's going to fall in line with that. Of course, once the objective truth is known, as he says, appropriation is an easy manner. Of course, I'm going to make it my own if you show me that it's true. But that's the very thing that Kierkegaard is denying. What he's saying is, that's actually not how it works. Strong evidence does not create a choice to be a believer. Being a Danish citizen does not create the choice to be a believer. The sweep of Hegelian history does not create the choice in an individual to be a believer. Each individual is free, and freedom is a key concept. Each individual must make the choice based on his or her own subjectivity and passion. Is it that the evidence doesn't matter? No. But the evidence does not create the response of the person. It is up to the person to decide how they're going to respond. That's his emphasis. So, one other quote that I like, that there is no direct and immediate transition to Christianity, and that therefore all those who in that way want to give a rhetorical push in order to bring one into Christianity, or even help one into it by a thrashing, they are all deceivers. No, they know not what they do. That word direct is very important for Kierkegaard. There is no direct transition to Christianity. That is, there is nothing that anybody can say to me. There is nothing that anybody can do to me. There are no life circumstances that I would be in. There is nothing external to me that can directly cause what the Bible would talk about as faith, as a response, a personal response of embracing this truth. Because my subjective self always has the final word. Okay, that's his deal. Okay, that brings us then to this concept of the leap of faith. Essentially, we already know now what the leap of faith is. If you've followed what it is that I've been saying, and if you didn't, I would understand that because I know it's complicated. But basically, the leap of faith is just a different way of thinking about what we have just been talking about. Kierkegaard has gotten a lot of grief for the leap of faith over the years. I'm quite convinced that we have largely misunderstood what he meant when he was talking about this stuff. He's typically described as meaning that we have no rational reason to believe, so we must just make an irrational leap to faith, but that's not it at all. Put simply, the leap is just another way of saying what we were just talking about. There is no direct transition to Christianity. If you picture faith as being on the other side of a ditch, there is nothing external to me that will carry me over to the other side. So you might picture, okay, I've got this ditch. Well, what if I do like a landfill thing? I'm going to take all these evidences and all these powerful sermons, and let's throw in a little Hegelian synthesis, and let's get all this. Surely I can fill this thing up enough so that I'll find myself on the other side before you know it. And what Kierkegaard is saying is, no, the fact is there is nothing that is going to do that. You're going to have to jump. You're going to have to make this decision to jump. He's not saying that there's no rational reason to jump, but what he is saying is those rational reasons cannot jump for you. They're not going to put you on the other side. You're going to have to put yourself on the other side. Now, there's a lot that could be said about this. This is a very interesting and concluding unscientific postscript. Kierkegaard is interacting with the writings of an earlier German thinker named Lessing, and he's the one who kind of introduces the concept of the leap, and Kierkegaard is sort of interacting with what he said in kind of an ironic and funny sort of way. But essentially, it comes down to what I'm saying here, is that no rational evidence is enough to carry one over to the other side. It's not that rational evidence has nothing to do with the decision to get on the other side, and Kierkegaard never says that it doesn't. But I myself must appropriate the truth of Christianity, acquire it, possess it, decide for it myself. So nothing is going to carry me over to the other side. He has some funny stuff about the stories of Baron Munchausen, where I might just sort of close my eyes and say, I forget, Eins, zwei, drei, Cochalorum, or something like that, and open my eyes, and I'm on the other side of the ditch. And ta-da! I got there. He says, no, it doesn't work that way. You're going to have to jump. That's what he is saying. You have to make the decision that you're going to embrace this thing. Okay, so this brings me then to the last part of this that I wanted to talk about. This concept that truth is subjectivity, because this is now a further step in what it is we've been talking about. Because now we're getting into that area. He's going to talk to us about what is truth. And he wants to say truth is not an objective thing, truth is a subjective thing. And immediately the alarm bells go off and go, wait a minute. And the alarm bells go off for me, because if that were to mean the right sort of thing, I would go running out of the room at that. No, that is not true. But I don't think that's what he's saying. But it's tricky. It is hard. It's not the stupidest thing in the world that some people have concluded that Kierkegaard does mean something like that, because he's tough to understand at certain points. So let's start with his definition of truth, which is really tough to try to sort out. What in the world does this mean? This is truth, according to Kierkegaard Climacus. An objective uncertainty held fast through appropriation with the most passionate inwardness. That sounds bad. I mean, I don't know what you think, but that sounds bad. It kind of sounds like it's saying truth is, I don't really have any reason to think it's true, but I'm really going to believe it anyway. That's truth. That would be bad. Okay, so notice I have here, C. Stephen Evans is an author that I really like on Kierkegaard. I think he really understands Kierkegaard, and I find him helpful. This is a quote that he has. This is from a textbook on philosophy. This quote is describing what Kierkegaard believes about truth. So this is a philosophy textbook telling us what Kierkegaard believes about truth. The belief of a Hindu that Vishnu is God, the belief of a Mohammedan that Allah is God, even the belief of an atheist that there is no God, all are true, providing only that in each of these beliefs an objective uncertainty is embraced with a passionate intensity. There are a number of people who think that's what Kierkegaard is saying, but that is That is awful. I mean, not only is that an awful thing to say, but it's an awful thing to say about Kierkegaard, because that's not what he thinks. But I admit, it can sound like that's what he thinks. So there comes a point at which I have to stop quoting him because there's so many difficult things to sort out. So some of this I'm just going to try to tell you what I think is happening. Here's what I think is the key idea here. We can talk about objective truth. If I have objective truth, then what I think about the object is true. Subjective truth is how I think about the object is true. That is my response to it, the subjective, the appropriation, and that sort of thing. So, an example that I made up. Bob understands the correct biblical teaching on the doctrine of the atonement. His theology of the atonement is objectively true. It accurately represents what the Bible is teaching. But he has not appropriated it. Subjectively, it is not for him. He, in fact, is a self-righteous person, and he doesn't truly believe that he needs forgiveness. So his doctrine of the atonement is correct, but he has not made it his own. He doesn't want it. Fred has the wrong understanding of the doctrine of the atonement. When he describes what the Bible teaches about the doctrine of the atonement, he's got it wrong. That's not how it works. So his theology of the atonement is objectively false. But he has related to that doctrine in truth. He rightly submits to the truth that he is a sinner and needs forgiveness. He appropriates this doctrine. He is grateful for what Jesus did on the cross for him, even though his theological belief about how that atonement works is not true, is objectively false. This is the kind of thing that Kierkegaard is talking about. What we're interested in, what Kierkegaard is saying is, when we're talking about essential truth, what does it mean for a person to be in truth? What does it mean for me to be a person who has the truth? Well, the key thing is that I am responding to it in a true way. That is, I want the truth. I long to know what is true. I long to pursue what is good, and I am heading in that direction. That's the kind of truth that we're most interested in. So, the obvious big question, does the objective truth matter? I mean, this is the thing that everybody is concerned about with Kierkegaard. He's charged that the objective truth doesn't matter. What matters is that we subjectively, passionately choose for ourselves. Well, I'm saying that to Kierkegaard, the objective truth absolutely matters. To be subjectively true means to be subjectively committed to pursuing the truth. That is, I have made this decision. I want what is true. I want what is good. The Christian is one who is choosing for the God who has revealed himself in Christ. It matters who that God is. It matters what that God says. But we need to put the emphasis in the right place on what it means to be true. Never in this life am I going to be certain that I understand all the truth about God, the objective truth about God. Some things I know I do not understand. Some things I think I do understand, but I'm wrong. If we define truth as a one-to-one correspondence between what I think and what is objectively true about God, then none of us really has the truth. I mean, we have some, but we have some error too. I mean, what the word he uses, we have an approximation. What truth is an approximation. But there's a more important sense that we can talk about having the truth, and that is having a subjectivity that is true. We care about what is true about God, and we pursue that truth and live in the light of it. That would be my argument for what Kierkegaard thinks about objective truth. I couldn't have a subjectively true attitude. I couldn't be a person who is in truth and not care about what is objectively true. I couldn't be a person who is subjectively committed to following God and not care about what is objectively true about God. The very fact that if something comes along and shows me that I need to change my thinking about God, and I would say, well, I don't care, I just subjectively respond to God, what that would show is that I'm not true. I'm really not subjectively interested in following that God. Okay, so stay with me on this. I'm going to keep trying to make my case for this. I know it's a tough one, but I'm going to persevere. One quote that I think is helpful from Kierkegaard is the statement, "Decision is the eternal protest against fictions." And here's what I think he's saying, and this is a very important clue to what it is that he's thinking about this. He's big on decision. Decision comes up over and over again in his writing, is that there has to be decision. You can tell that some abstract, speculative way of thinking is really irrelevant to human existence if it doesn't call on you to make a decision. That would show you that's something that's irrelevant and off in the corner. As Christians, we are called to be people of decision. We are called to decide for God. But clearly, Kierkegaard thinks that as we are deciding for God, it matters very much to us that we not decide for a fiction. The fact I am committed to decision, not just an arbitrary decision, I am committed to deciding for God. I am committed to deciding for the good. I am committed to deciding for what is true. So that kind of decision is an eternal protest against fictions. Whenever something starts to show itself as being a fiction, no, that's not true about God, immediately the buzzers go off because I'm about decision, not just any decision. I'm about the decision for God. So if I have a belief about God that is a fiction, I don't want it. So I think this is a real strong indicator that Kierkegaard is very interested in the objective truth of things, and we have to be interested in the objective truth of things. I don't know if this quote is going to be very clear, but I will try to make it clear, and I think it's very important. He says, "From the objective point of view, there is no infinite decision. And thus, it is objectively correct that the distinction between good and evil is cancelled, along with the principle of contradiction, and thereby also the infinite distinction between truth and falsehood. Only in subjectivity is there decision." Okay, I think that this is really important and fascinating. To me, it's fascinating. So someone like Schaeffer makes the charge against Kierkegaard that basically his emphasis on subjectivity destroys these objective distinctions between things. What has happened to our culture that we've lost the distinction between good and evil, or the principle of contradiction, the idea that A is not non-A, or the distinction between truth and falsehood? That's where our culture is. And what led to that? Well, one of the things that led to that is Kierkegaard and his emphasis on subjectivity. But Kierkegaard has turned this charge around in this statement. He's saying the person who emphasizes objective truth has lost sight of the fact that we must make an infinite decision, an unending decision for God and what is true and what is good and so on. We must persevere in deciding for God, and so the objective person is the one who has lost the important distinctions. If truth is just something that happens to me objectively, I'm just sort of a passive recipient of whatever's going on, then the distinction between good and evil, A and non-A, truth and falsehood, those distinctions have kind of become theoretical. They're not really of interest to me because it's all just kind of happening. It is the person who is personally invested in making the decision for God, for what is good, for what is right. That's the person who understands that there is a distinction between good and evil, and I am trying to decide for what is good. There's a distinction between the A and non-A, the two opposite things can't be true at the same time. So I have to decide one or the other. This is a particular shot at Hegel that we could bring out more, but his Hegel synthesis thing, Kierkegaard is big on the fact that what happened to the principle of contradiction. Okay, but truth and falsehood in particular, look, he's saying it is the subjective person who really understands the concept of objective truth and falsehood, because it is the objective person, the subjective person, who is deeply committed to making that choice for what is good, for what is true and not true, for and so on. So, from his perspective, it is the person engaged in the subjective striving to be a person who is living in truth. That is the person who is really committed to the idea of objective truth and falsehood, good and evil, and so on. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. I'm going to finish and then remember your question. I'm one of those. Well, it's past praying for. I'm one of those. Okay. So, here's a description that Kierkegaard gives of the situation of the subjective person dealing with God. I love this description. The existing person who chooses the subjective way instantly comprehends the whole dialectical difficulty, because he must use some time, perhaps a long time, to find God objectively. He comprehends this dialectical difficulty in all its pain because he must resort to God at that very moment, because every moment in which he does not have God is wasted. Okay, so you see the kind of thing that he's describing. I think many Christians can identify with the truth of this description. It describes my life, absolutely. I mean, this is my experience in coming to faith. I bowed the knee to God way before I understood very much about who God was or what he was. I mean, I knew nothing about the Bible. I heard a rumor that Jesus had something to do with it. You know, I had very little that I understood. But I came to that place where I realized this is a truth that I need to bow to, I need to submit to, I need to make a part of my life. And I would argue to the end of my days that that was not an irrational decision, but it was not the case that I objectively had figured out all the answers and said, okay, I have here's this objective statement about the truth of God that I can give to you that answers all the questions. And now that I've put the picture all together and I've answered all the questions and I've looked at it from every angle, I look at that and say, okay, I'll buy that, and I believe it. That's not how it works. The choice to believe, it's not irrational, but it is fundamentally a question about the will. What do I want to do with God? And oftentimes that choice is being made at a time when we recognize that I'm still a ways away from being able to answer even some of my own questions about how this stuff works. So notice that the subjectivity of this person is in truth, according to the way Kierkegaard would talk about it. He knows he needs God, but he knows that his objective understanding of God has a long way to go. I think of Peter in the Gospel of John, chapter 6. Jesus has just said some very weird stuff about how everybody needs to eat his flesh and drink his blood. And the crowds have listened to this and they've decided, this is too weird, we don't want this, and they leave. And so Jesus turns to the 12 disciples and asks them, are you going to leave too? And Peter says, where would we go? You have the words of eternal life. I think it's obvious that Peter is just as confused as the crowd about what Jesus just said. He doesn't know what it means to eat his flesh and drink his blood. And the disciples often make it clear that they don't understand much of what's going on, actually, what Jesus is saying, what he's doing, where this whole thing is going. So his objective understanding of what it means to eat Jesus' flesh is greatly deficient at that point, but his subjectivity is true. He has responded to what he has seen, to what he does understand. He rightly sees that Jesus is from God and that he has come to bring life, and he wants to be a part of that. That is his passion. He wants to be with him. I don't know what you just meant, but I think you're on the right track. I'm with you. So I think that's the sort of thing that Kierkegaard is getting at. This is what he means by truth is subjectivity. The truth that is important is being a person who is true in such a way that you want to choose for God and for what is true and for what is right. That's more important than having the objective truth. Okay. Just a couple more things to explain here. Related to this, we come back to that definition that he gave of truth. An objective uncertainty held fast through appropriation with the most passionate inwardness. It really helps to understand this very strange definition if you realize that his model for this definition is Socrates. As you read through it, it becomes clear that that's his model. Remember, the Oracle of Delphi had said that Socrates was the wisest man in Athens. And Socrates looked at himself and said, I don't know how that can be. I don't really feel like I'm all that wise. So he went around talking to everybody, and he said, you know what I finally figured out is all those people I talked to, they think they got it all figured out. I happen to know that I do not have it all figured out. That makes me the wisest man in Athens, because everybody else thinks they've got it figured out, and I know that I don't. Now, Socrates is not a skeptic. I think this is very important for us to understand. Socrates' position wasn't that nobody can know anything. I don't know anything. Nobody knows anything. We just give up and just admit that we don't know anything. What he believes, though, is that we should strive for the good. We should strive for what is true. We should care about what is true. We should pursue what is true and good. And so he asks those questions of people. Well, do you understand what this is? He's always trying to inspire them to recognize, no, I don't know. I don't understand that. I should pursue this more. I should try to find out what this thing is. And so we should always be honest and ready to admit that we were wrong and that we should change our minds. So Socrates had an objective uncertainty. He knew that there was always more to learn. He knew that he could be wrong. He wasn't certain in the truths that he had come to believe, but he thought, right now, this is my best understanding of what life is about, and this is what I'm operating on. And so he appropriated it. He said, I need to live this out. He believed in God, even though he wasn't sure about whether there was a God or not, but I think there is, and so I need to pursue that God. I need to live in a way that's pursuing what is good. Inwardly, he longed to have goodness and truth. So this definition of truth is really kind of a definition of someone like Socrates. He is pursuing the truth. He is appropriating the truth as best as he understands it with passionate inwardness. I want to be all about embracing and finding out what is good and true, even though I recognize that I have an objective uncertainty. I'm not certain about this. We tend to think that my commitment ought to be commensurate with how certain I am. The more certain I am, the more committed I will be to something. But when it comes to the essential religious truths, I'm going to have to make fundamental life commitments that are somewhat separate from my objective certainty. I can't prove everything. I don't know everything. I have reasons to think that certain things are true, but I have to go all in. I mean, this is a game that requires you to go all in. So that's I think, what he means by his definition. If we picture Socrates as kind of the model for that, then that's his definition. I have one last comment, and then I will quit. I know this is a lot. And it might seem like I'm jumping to an entirely different topic. This is not an entirely different topic. This is the same topic that we were just talking about. The topic is indirect discourse. Kierkegaard is famous for his concept of indirect discourse, but I would argue that it is very much connected with the ideas that we have just been talking about. It is sometimes understood to mean that we shouldn't say directly what we mean. And that there is an element of that to it. That can be true at times. The model is sometimes given of something like the parables of Jesus, or Socrates' questioning approach to things, where the person is left to think for themselves about what it is that we're talking about. And yes, that is a part of the model of what indirect discourse is all about. But I think it's more complicated than that. There's a more fundamental truth involved. And I had some quotes I was going to take you through. It's too much. Let me just tell you what I think it is, and then we'll stop. The logic of indirect discourse is as follows. Let's take as our idea, Jesus died for our sins. Okay? So that's an objective truth that we can talk about with each other publicly. You and I can talk about what it means. What does it mean that Jesus died for our sins? What does it mean to be a sinner? What did that death accomplish? There's much that we could talk about. Why do I think that's true? What passages in the Bible talk about that? All of that is objective stuff that we can all together go and look at that stuff and talk about it. But what about this other part, the personally appropriating the truth? That place where I decide that this is for me and this is what I want my life to be about. That is private and free. I have to personally appropriate this truth for myself. No one else can do it for me. They can't talk me into it. They can't tell me jokes and get me feeling good so that I'll do it. They can't weep and moan and make me cry over my sins and make me do it. There's nothing that they can do to make me do it. I have to choose it for myself. That means then that when I look at my own situation, I recognize I am free. I have to make this choice for myself. Nothing out there compelled me to do it. So now I'm going to take on the task of talking to you about that choice. So I'm remembering myself. I'm free. This is a choice that I had to make for myself. So when I'm talking to you, I have to recognize that you are free as well. And so my job is to respect your freedom when I am communicating with you. My job is not direct communication in the sense that my choice gets imposed on you, but rather what I'm doing is I am communicating in such a way where I am respecting, I'm leaving you the room to make that choice for yourself. Sometimes that can mean speaking obliquely, leaving you saying something provocative and leaving you to figure out what it means. But sometimes Kierkegaard gives examples of places where somebody says something directly. They say exactly what they mean. And yet he would say, this was indirect discourse in the sense that it left room for the other person. It respected the freedom of that other person in the decision that they make. He's particularly down on manipulation. The thing is, see, if I communicate to you my passion somehow in talking to you about these things, the danger is that your relationship is not going to be to the God that I was relating to. Your relationship is going to be to me. You like me. You think I'm funny. You think, oh, that's such a compelling story. Oh, he went through such difficult things. Look at what happened to him. And so I am a God follower and you become a Ron follower because I have roused up something in you. But see, I don't want a Ron follower. I want you to be a God follower. So I'm going to beat you over the head and say, follow God. Well, nobody beat me over the head to make me follow God, so what's going to make you do it? Nothing. So I have to make this choice to treat you as a free person in the way that I interact with you. So that's what indirect discourse is about. Fundamentally, it relates back to this idea of the free, subjective individual choosing for himself or herself how they're going to relate to God. And indirect discourse is a way of respecting that process in the other person. Okay, conclusion. Why Kierkegaard? Hey, there's a lot of stuff about Kierkegaard I didn't talk about here tonight. A lot of it I didn't talk about because I don't know about it, because there's a lot in Kierkegaard. Some of it I do know about. There's a whole side of Kierkegaard that we didn't talk about here tonight, which is where he actually gets into the question of the content of Christianity itself. That is, okay, this is all about that subjective choice, but what am I choosing for? What is this Christianity thing that I'm making this subjective choice for? And so he has various things to say. He talks about the nature of sin. You know, here he's saying that subjectivity is truth. And he says, yeah, but you know, the place where you got to start is the reality that subjectivity is untruth. That is, my subjective is sin. I'm a sinner. I'm evil. My subjective person is not true. It's false. So that complicates things quite a bit. So that's one of the things that you have to deal with in Christianity, a fundamental thing. Jesus himself is a hard guy to understand and follow. He describes him as kind of as the offense, as a stumbling block, because there's so much about Jesus that we have to get over, that we have to say, wow, that's tough, or that's weird, or, you know, I mean, it's like the eat my flesh stuff. It's like, who is this guy that we're following here? So all of that stuff essentially comes down to, it adds up together to Christianity is a subjective personal choice to embrace the difficult, hard truths about God and myself. That I'm a sinner, that Jesus is calling us. He wants me to join him on the cross somehow. What is that all about? What is that? How would that be a good thing for me? So this is why I like Kierkegaard so much. Because for my money, he puts the emphasis in the right place. Christianity is not primarily about having the right doctrinal beliefs. It has something to do with right doctrinal beliefs. I'm not saying that it doesn't. But it is about personally embracing those doctrines, making them my own, living them out. That's what Kierkegaard's all about, and that's what I see the Bible saying. I think that is the essential message of Christianity. And so that is what I see as the enduring value of reading Kierkegaard for the Christian. Of all of the thinkers that I have seen in our intellectual history, Kierkegaard seems to me to get the closest to what the whole story is really about, what the issue is really about for us. He is also really, really hard to read. So I'm admitting it's not for everybody. I'm not saying you need to go and read this all the time, because I know lots of people who hear these kind of talks and they go and start reading Kierkegaard and they come back and go, what did you have me do here? Could you know, that story of I made it so many pages into this book and then I put it down because I have no idea what I'm reading. I know that's a reality. But if you like funny, sarcastic, poetic, challenging reflections on the fundamental truths of human existence and our relationship with God, then he is your man. Okay, that's it. Okay, so if you remember your question, Logan, you should ask it. Do we have the microphone?
I'm thinking about the experience of Romans 1, it was 18 to 21.
Uh-huh.
Someone sees what God has made.
Yes.
And from that should know,
yes,
can know a great deal
right.
about God's nature and power. Okay.
Right.
So you got the atheist that looks at it and goes, it'd make a nice painting. Right?
Okay.
And then you got the objectivist would say, that must be from God. Let's go have lunch.
Okay.
Right?
It could be. I mean, it depends on what particular manifestation of this objectivity that you're talking about. But it might be a perspective that says, yeah, there's lots of There's lots of evidence objectively. Let me articulate for you what some of the evidence is for the existence of God. So yeah, I believe in God. So it might not be so dismissive as let's go have lunch. It might be, yeah, okay, yeah, I believe in God. But have I appropriated it? Have I actually gotten to the spot where the God who has revealed himself in the Bible can come along and say, you have a problem, and I bow to that and say, you're right, I have a problem. That's a different thing. That objective view puts the emphasis on what you really need is objective evidence, and then everything will fall in place. Then once you have enough to really have you convinced that it's the case, then of course you're gonna fall in line. I can say, by the way, that this is the way when I was a determined atheist as a young man, this is the way I thought about things. I used to say to people, I remember, if there was solid evidence that there was a God, then of course I would be an idiot not to believe in God and follow God and become a Christian and do all of that stuff. The reason that I'm not one, of course, is that there isn't that compelling evidence that is going to force me to find this is true. And in my own personal conversion, one of the key aspects to it was to discover, you are not as objective about all this as you thought. The fact is that you don't want God. So what are you going to do about that? What about your objective evidence now? How much objective evidence do I have to show you, Ron, before you admit that you just don't want this to be true? So
you were a ditch digger.
Yeah, yeah.
So who are this is a weird question. Those who know me won't shudder. What's the experience of the demons that James describes?
Right. Well, I think what's important, I don't know how to exactly describe the experience of the demons, but I think we can understand the point that James makes from it, which is that knowledge of the doctrinal truth is not enough. That's not what is required here. So the statement is, you believe that God is one, which is the classic Jewish Orthodox statement. God is one. Say, okay, and you believe that. Okay, his thing is, that and $1.50 will get you a cup of coffee. Is what he's basically saying is the demons think that's true. Because the issue is that subjective personal response to it. I believe that, and so I live as if it's true. I see that God has made promises, he has made demands, he has a certain character, and I look at that and I say, that is the world I live in. That is what I must adapt myself to. So that's that subjective kind of truth that would say, that truth is so true, I actually think it's true. So I'm going to live as if it's true.
I have two questions.
Okay.
First question. So there's various places in the New Testament, probably Paul, maybe some of the other ones, where they go through and they list various things like disobedient parents. Let's take that one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay.
These people will not inherit the kingdom of God.
Okay.
It seems to me in the categories that you're dealing with that there is some you cannot value that, or you cannot appropriate that and then also be living in truth.
Appropriate that as in
appropriate, like I live out this sin, right? I'm going to decide I'm going to do this, and you can't do that and then also be in truth.
Yeah, I mean, you can come at it from different angles, right? Because you might think of it from the negative side. There is a truth about how God wants us to live. And if I were to appropriate that, then I would see this way of living, like the disobedience to parents and so forth. I would see that as this is not at the heart of what I'm called to be. So now, the New Testament also, and so does Kierkegaard, by the way, acknowledges the difficulty of that, and that we struggle, and that I might come to believe that I ought to pursue God's vision of what a human life should be like, and find it very difficult to do. But you can be subjectively true in that you are striving. That is the thing. I believe that that's the case. So I'm confessing, I'm saying I'm not living up to that because I think it's important to live up to that, and I'm not. So in that sense, then maybe it's the absence of appropriating a picture that I ought to, especially for a Jew in that setting. I don't know.
I guess my question has to do with if I can be closer to God by appropriating a heresy than I could be by not appropriating
a truth.
A truth. The question is sin heretical, or is it a different thing?
Yeah, well, let me step back from Kierkegaard. I could think about various things that I might point to, but let's step back to the New Testament in regard to that. The question of believing what is true is a complex one. At times, my belief in, say, the truth that Jesus is the Messiah or something like that, this is an indictment of the subjectivity, say, of the Pharisees. When Jesus says, you Pharisees spend all your time in the scriptures, studying them day and night, because you think that in them you will find eternal life. And yet, you don't want me. You are not willing to come to me. So there we have a situation where the knowledge that Jesus is the Messiah, the fact that they don't believe that truth, is an indicator of a subjective disease, that they want something else. And he goes on to say, how can you believe when you seek glory from one another rather than glory from God? Okay, you have desires that are keeping you from coming to an understanding of the truth. But on the other hand, we have the situation in Romans, which I think about constantly as I'm going through this Kierkegaard stuff because it's very relevant. The situation where in Rome you have Gentiles and Jews who are Christians together, and the Jewish element thinks that there are certain things that God does not want us to be eating. And the Gentile element is thinking we are free to eat whatever. Okay, well, doctrinally, one of those groups is wrong. One of those group that thinks God doesn't want us to eat this, they're actually wrong about that. God doesn't care whether you eat that or not. But they're convinced that God cares about it, and so they are being obedient to God. They are reacting to a prohibition that is a fiction in a sense, but they don't know it. They think it's true. They have every reason to think that it's true. And so they're not eating that stuff because they don't think God wants them to. And Paul's saying to the ones who feel free to eat, you should not be looking down on them. Because why aren't they eating? They're not eating because their subjectivity is true. I mean, he doesn't use that language, but what he's saying is they're not eating because they're being obedient to God. That's what you should respect in them and not be beating them up for the fact that you think they've got their doctrine wrong. So doctrine can be a key indicator of a heart that's gone wrong, or doctrine can be one of those things that I'm on my way to sorting out, but meanwhile, while I have not sorted it out, I still have a heart for God. I mean, and both of those truths can happen. And that's what I see in Kierkegaard. I think he has a very complex philosophical way of describing that phenomenon. I think that's the thing that he's talking about. In fact, I would bet you that Kierkegaard has some of those passages in the Bible in mind when he's writing that stuff. We're past our time. I should probably... Oh, you said 2 questions?
Well, I'll ask you.
Okay, well, you have the mic. Go ahead. One more, and then we'll stop. Yeah.
Just really quickly, thank you very much. That was wonderful. I was wondering if you could speak really quickly to the importance of one of the facts you mentioned, that Kierkegaard was writing at a time, a particular cultural, historical moment when what he was saying seemed especially pressing, urgent, necessary to be said.
Right.
And Francis Schaeffer is writing at a different cultural moment.
Yes.
And I'm wondering whether that can excuse somewhat Schaeffer's dismissal of Kierkegaard, whether perhaps the emphasis on subjective truth might take a second place to an emphasis on objective truth in our particular cultural moment, or whether something like someone referred to Romans, the heavens declare the majesty of God, whether that is not and will never really be the problem, people's rational obstacles to faith.
Yeah. So, I'm ready to cut Schaeffer a lot of slack. Yes, you're right. And I mean, what happens? This often happens. I think it can even be true for the way Kierkegaard is looking at Hegel. It's as much a reaction to what people did with Hegel afterwards as what Hegel himself said, although Kierkegaard doesn't like what Hegel said either. But Schaeffer acknowledges, he kind of acknowledges that what he's really kind of reacting to is where things went from Kierkegaard and what people understood Kierkegaard to be saying. Although Schaeffer also makes it clear that he pretty much thinks that Kierkegaard thought that stuff too. So he's not wrong that those sorts of ideas took hold and that in our time we need to push back against those ideas. I think he's right about that. But the challenge is that two things. Everybody recognizes, as much as evangelicals loved the influence, or some did, that Schaeffer had, everyone recognizes we've all had the experience of an expert in some field coming along and saying, I really loved Schaeffer, except when he talks about that. I happen to know something about that, and that wasn't right. And then somebody over here will come along and say, well, I really love Schaeffer, except when he talks about this, because I know something about that, and that wasn't right. And you start to recognize that Schaeffer was very much a generalist who was sometimes making claims about stuff that he didn't know much about. So that's not the greatest thing in the world. I think that's something that we can push back against. And the most important thing is the distortion of Kierkegaard's ideas, which I think Schaeffer has done, has kind of robbed us of the opportunity of confronting some really important stuff that Kierkegaard is talking about. You're certainly right that conditions change, and what was a problem for them is, in some senses, a different sort of problem for us. But there's that fundamental thing that is always true about human nature, and that from Adam and Eve until this very moment in this class right now, human existence has always been about decision. And Kierkegaard is right about that. And you and I face that decision right now. So we don't want to rob him of the opportunity to convince us that that's the case, I think. Okay, we should stop. Great, thanks for coming. Really appreciate it.